everyone, I'm Uriah Heep. This is my Literary Cafe, and tonight we'll be seeing another episode of the Author's Matrix Great American Novel Series. Dramatic readings of popular novels. And the novel we're reading right now is The Village Idiot by Dan Blanchfield. In the last episode, Nigel sat down with Professor Umph. It didn't go well. And next chapter 14, the conversation continues. And I'm afraid it gets worse. And then he talks to his parents. Oh my. Well, we'll see what happens. So, without further ado, on to chapter 14 of The Village Idiot. Take it away.
Chapter 14. Nigel could not speak. His words failed him. Seeing the pained expression on his face, the professor broke the silence. His name is Addison Way, if my memory serves me correctly. He was among the brightest, most talented students ever to set foot on our esteemed university. However, he came to this foolish notion that the raw sewage water that sustains us is somehow injurious to us. It was poppycock for sure, but this young, impressionable student took it upon himself to attempt to upend hundreds of years of scientific research, all on his own. He squandered valuable university resources, secretly running experiments proving that the water we consume was bad for us. Imagine the abject ignorance and arrogance of that. Nigel sat back in his chair, more confused than ever. He was expelled from the university? Yes, indeed, Crumbly. The dean at the time suspected this student right from the beginning, but the faculty tried to convince him to give this student a fair chance to prove himself. I am afraid this chance led to his ruin, as one could have predicted. His ruin? Nigel asked meekly. This Addison Way character secretly used university resources to conduct experiments on the sly. But the dean was onto him. He would have allowed him to stay on and continue his studies if he had simply renounced the nonsense he was engaged in and walked the straight and narrow. But sadly, this young, ignorant student could not. Then, there was the fatal blow that ended his career. What was that, Professor? Nigel asked. This foolish young man took his so-called research to the Village Crumbly Times, the professor explained, the most prestigious paper of our time, and tried to buffalo them into reporting on his scientific research. It was pure lunacy. This sadly naive student thought that the paper of record in all the land would give him his due and he would change the world. Sadly, he was mistaken. They dubbed him the Village Idiot for foolishly challenging the status quo in the field of science. And I say that they did rightfully so. Nigel was stunned into silence, yet again. Is this meeting of this foolish old man the impetus behind your sudden interest in water, Nigel? I spent an afternoon with him, Professor, Nigel began as he regained his voice, and he told me about his research. I was impressed. It all sounded so logical at the time. Let me stop you right there, Crumbly, Professor Umph interjected. There is nothing new to learn here, and you should understand that fact right now before it is too late. You cannot find any top academics in all the land that would adhere to this lunatic's theories. They are all poppycock, and I say that kindly. Think of it, Crumbly. If the press of our day, the academic world, and the scientific community have dismissed pseudo-scientist Addison Way and his scientific findings, that should satisfy your curiosity. Have they studied his findings, Professor? Nigel asked. The professor was now growing visibly annoyed at his young student. The experts in their fields already know all about this, Crumbly. There is no reason they should waste their valuable time chasing every harebrained scheme that comes their way. Nigel rightly felt no reason to continue this conversation with Professor Umph. He could not make sense of the fact that his learned professor could exhibit such a closed mind on this subject. I should go, Professor, Nigel said as he stood up. Let there be no more talk of this foolishness, Crumbly, Professor Umph said as he dismissed Nigel from his office. Nigel nodded in assent, but felt queasy as he left his professor's office. Nigel took his remaining classes that day but was not present. He did not recall anything he heard in the lectures, as his mind dwelt on the conversation with Professor Umph. How could a man of science like the professor be so terribly closed-minded? Nigel thought to himself as he trudged home that evening. He wasn't even willing to discuss Addison's work, let alone acknowledge the possibility that he might have come to something. Why was he so opposed to the possibility that the scientific community might have been wrong all these years? When Nigel returned home that evening, he was greeted by his parents, who were already at the dining table expecting his imminent return. His solemn look did not go unnoticed by Jonah and Edith, and they looked at each other. "How was class today, Nigel?" Edith asked, smiling broadly. Her attempt to cheer up her son with such a question failed, and Nigel grunted as he sat down for the evening meal. He stared at the putrid sludge set before him, and again felt ill. His mum had prepared their supper with an extra helping of raw sewage, and the steaming plate set before Nigel reeked. "What is it, son?" Jonah asked, as he plunged his spoon deep into his porridge. "It looks like you have seen a ghost," Jonah said, chortling out loud. Nigel had been determined to relate nothing of his conversation with Professor Umph to his parents, but he could not help himself. He had no appetite, and his stomach was in knots. He felt he had no choice. "I met with Professor Umph this afternoon." "A private meeting with your professor?" Edith asked. "Yes, Mum," Nigel continued. "We met in his office." Both Edith and Jonah said nothing, waiting for Nigel to say more. He did after quite a long, uncomfortable pause. "I don't know how to tell you this," Nigel said haltingly. "It was quite a disturbing conversation." Jonah put down his spoon. "What did the professor wish to speak with you about?" his mum asked. "Was it about your work in his class?" "Oh, no, Mum," Nigel said. "I sought the conversation with him." "Whatever for?" his parents said in unison. "It is a long story," Nigel began. "Mum and father—" He proceeded to regurgitate the entire conversation with his parents in excruciating detail. He left nothing to the imagination. He hoped his parents would see his professor's abject ignorance and close-mindedness, but they did not. "Foolish child," Edith shrieked. "Why would you challenge your professor so? Don't you know your place, Nigel? Is this how we raised you?" Jonah nodded in agreement. "Your mum is right, Nigel," Jonah joined in. "This is a disgraceful performance on your part. You are risking your future career with such insolence." Nigel expected sympathy from his parents, but received vitriol instead. He was stunned. "Father, Mum," he replied. "How is asking a man of science a question about science disgraceful?" "Is that what you think you did, Nigel?" Jonah asked, his face turning beet red. "Yes, Father," Nigel implored. "I was quite respectful, you can be sure. I questioned whether the raw sewage humanity consumes is the bane of our existence. Why should I not question this?" "Water again!" his mum shrieked. "Why is it always about water, of all things?" "Plenty of fresh water runs in the open sewer trench outside our house. We are blessed. Why would you question any of this, especially to your professor?" Although Nigel related his conversation with Professor Umph, he did leave out one crucial detail. He failed to mention Addison Way. He was embarrassed, and he did not know why. As his parents further grilled their son about the conversation with his professor, Nigel felt that he must relate the entirety of the conversation with his professor. "There is one other detail I failed to reveal. Father and Mum." His parents sat still, waiting for what their son might say next. "I failed to relate my reference to the elderly man I recently met in the Highlands," Nigel began. "I met him quite by accident. He is very kind and showed me his lab set behind his cabin." Nigel's parents failed to grasp what they were being told. They listened to Nigel, but were lost. "This elderly gentleman," Nigel continued, "despite his advanced age, is in excellent physical condition. He has spent his life studying water's nature and made some remarkable discoveries. His studies show that the raw sewage water humanity has consumed for centuries deleteriously affects our lives. It is poison. This scientist has perfected removing all the contaminants from water and enabling us to have pure, clean water for our needs. He has been using this pure water for decades, and his robust health is evidence of the efficacy of his scientific theories. Jonah and Edith sat listening to their son, dumbfounded. They barely understood anything Nigel had just said. They sat quietly, both gaunt and pale, with open sores oozing toxic fluid, and could not make any sense of what their only son had just related to them. "This is about water again, Nigel," Jonah asked. "Why, Nigel?" "Father," he replied, "Addison Way is a brilliant scientist." Nigel said this confidently, even as he remained confused about Addison's theories. The backs and forth about Addison were terrible. The doubts he had about the knowledge shared with him were slowly dissipating, but he remained entirely unconvinced. So, why was he giving his parents the feeling that he was sure? Nigel did not know. Perhaps the increasing confidence in Addison's scientific studies was due to the fierce opposition he had received from the authorities of the day. Why was everyone so closed-minded? Why would the academics of Addison's day and today refuse to study his work with the desire to know and see what was true? Where did this fierce opposition come from? It was a mystery to Nigel. Jonah suddenly looked up. "Addison? Addison Way, did you say, Nigel?" "Yes, Father," Nigel replied. "My goodness!" Jonah shouted. "Addison Way!" "The village idiot? I know that name from my childhood. Everyone in the village knew of that lunatic up in the Highlands and his scientific experiments. It is no wonder that your professor stopped your nonsense immediately." Nigel slumped in his chair. He now realized that this was a mistake. He never should have shared the conversation with his professor with his parents, but it was too late now. "This professor saved your academic career, Nigel," Jonah said emphatically. "You should be thanking him profusely." Nigel stared at his parents, looking like living corpses waiting for the grave. "Addison taught me more in one lecture than I have learned all my time at the university." "You take lectures from this crazy person, Nigel," Edith said, clutching her house dress. Nigel stiffened in his chair. "When I met him, he showed me his cabin in the Highlands and the lab he built. It is an impressive structure indeed. It had everything a university lecture hall and lab would have. He told me about his research and what he had discovered. It was awe-inspiring." "What are you talking about, Nigel?" Jonah interrupted. "A building is not a university. Anyone can build a structure, but the university has the knowledge of the world in it. That is the difference." "What good is a building if the occupants in that building are close-minded and ignorant?" Nigel replied. "Nigel!" Edith shouted. "How dare you speak of your professors in such a way? They have dedicated their lives to educating ignorant children like yourself. You should listen to them and not ask so many annoying questions." It was evident to Nigel that this conversation with his parents was devolving into sheer lunacy. His parents exhibited the same narrow-minded attitude he met in Professor Umph, and he saw no way to counter it successfully. Nigel dutifully attended his classes for the better part of the following week. He did not raise any controversial questions in class. Instead, he took notes, completed his readings, and finished the obligatory labs in his science classes. It was all a very dull business for Nigel. His thoughts kept drifting back to his meeting with Addison Way. Although he still harboured doubts, he could not help thinking back to the sheer logic of Addison's lecture. What Nigel did not realise just yet, but the doubts he held onto, were not because he legitimately questioned the efficacy of Addison's work, but rather the fact that none of the authorities of the day would acknowledge it. If he could see this snobbish working in him, it would change his life. When the week wound down, and Thursday arrived, Nigel decided it was time to visit Addison again. He was determined to attend one of his formal lectures with other students present. He reasoned that he could gain additional insight into Addison's work if he met other students studying with him for years. After attending his classes during the day, he avoided going home and returned to the Highlands. When he arrived at Addison's cabin, he saw little activity. He had expected to see a large group of Addison's students milling about, waiting for his lecture to begin. "Hello!" Nigel heard from behind him. Addison was walking around the corner of his modest cabin and greeted him. "It is good to see you, my friend," Addison continued. "You are here for my lecture, I presume?" "Yes, sir," Nigel replied. "Fine," Addison replied. "We are about to begin." Addison led Nigel back to his lab, and the two entered. The room was populated with about a dozen individuals milling about, awaiting the beginning of the lecture. The first thing that struck Nigel was that everyone in the room seemed to share the same robust health. He witnessed no sores, cracked teeth, or chunks of missing hair. They all looked much like Addison himself, but the ages of the students present were from Nigel's age to one elderly woman who appeared even older than Addison himself. "Have a seat, Nigel," Addison urged, "and we can begin." Nigel swiftly sat in the back and opened his satchel to retrieve his notebook and pen. This was a habit from his university classes, and he never varied from it. He was a serious student. Addison strode to the front of the makeshift lecture hall and greeted all of his students. "Before we begin tonight's lecture, let me invite everyone to enjoy a glass of fresh water just cleansed this morning." He pointed to the side of the hall and indicated where this drink could be had. Nigel remained in his seat as the students stood up and returned to this much-anticipated refreshment. He was struck by how eagerly the other students flocked to the table with the fresh, clean water. He was undoubtedly used to drinking water, but as it was typically full of rancid, raw sewage, he never felt the eagerness the individuals displayed in front of him this evening. He noticed that Addison had glanced in his direction and was embarrassed to be still sitting in his seat as the others made their way to the fresh water offered by himself. Still, Nigel remained in his seat, awaiting the beginning of the lecture. Addison's lecture lasted the better part of an hour. Nigel was captivated from the very start. Addison explained in plain English the nature of water and why humanity needs to drink only water devoid of contaminants. He gave evidence that all the raw sewage that humanity's water contained wreaked havoc on one's overall health and well-being. Nigel eagerly took copious notes, filling a dozen pages in his makeshift notebook. "This is brilliant," Nigel thought to himself as he listened to the lecture. "Why didn't I see this before?" was the question he kept asking himself as the lecture continued. As Addison's lecture concluded, he invited audience members to ask questions. A few hands were raised, and questions were asked and answered crisply, much to the delight of the participants. As no more questions were posed, Nigel timidly raised his hand. Upon acknowledgement from Addison, Nigel asked, "Sir, why is it that no one knows of your work after all these years?" Addison has often heard this question for nearly 4 decades, which always saddened him. He thought back to his university days when he made his momentous discoveries, sure that the academic world would embrace his findings and humanity would be infinitely better off. The others in the class had heard this question asked many times before. No one stirred, but waited for Addison's response. "That is an excellent question, Nigel," Addison began, "and I am grateful you asked. The students in this room have heard me answer that question many times. Some of the students in this room have been studying this subject with me for decades, and the question you just posed has been asked many times by the newcomers who have joined our class." Nigel awaited Addison's explanation. "You see, Nigel," Addison continued, "this is not only about the nature of water and its importance to humanity. It is quite a bit more than that. As you go through life, Nigel, you will find that individuals have a deep preference to feel that they have a right to a notion of themselves as superior to anything or anyone they may meet or think about. It is the most hurtful thing in man. It is worse than the horrific water they drink. One would think that if a person was presented with incontrovertible scientific evidence, their eyes would open immediately, and they would be grateful for the new knowledge. But, alas, that is not the case. I was a university student like yourself when I made the discoveries I presented here tonight. I was naive to believe that presenting my findings to the university hierarchy would be embraced. Sadly, it was not. I was expelled and banned from any more university study. The professors and administration of the university, to a man, were terribly angry with me. Why were they angry? Nigel asked incredulously. They were angry, Addison explained, because they had something large and new in the world to learn from me, and they resented it terribly. I saw this anger up close and was the personal recipient of it. The other students present at this lecture sat quietly in their seats as Addison answered Nigel's question. Some nodded in agreement, and some had tears well up. Those present on that fateful day knew of the greatness of the one who taught them so courageously, and they were moved by his answer to the young university student sitting among them that evening. I wish it were not so, Nigel, Addison continued, but it is the reality we face today. Meanwhile, the life-giving nature of pure, clean water strengthens everyone in our lives, and we should rejoice at that scientific fact and celebrate it. As Addison concluded his remarks and bid his students farewell for the evening, Nigel sat by himself in the back of the room, contemplating the import of the lecture he was privileged to hear in person. The students departed, with each one carrying a jug of some of the fresh water to carry home. Nigel was the last to leave, and Addison also ensured he took his jug of water. Here, Nigel, Addison said as he handed him the jug. It is only a small amount for now, but in the future I will teach you how to access much more fresh water in your own house. I have set up a system to supply my students with limited clean water in their homes to meet their daily needs. Nigel accepted the gift of water from Addison and expressed his gratitude. There was no more conversation between them, save Addison's invitation to Nigel to come to his lecture next Thursday. I will be lecturing on the microscopic evidence for the value of purified water. It is a lecture you surely do not want to miss. Addison's enthusiasm was contagious, and Nigel readily agreed to attend next week's lecture. It was late in the evening when Nigel arrived home, only to find his parents asleep in their bedroom. The stench of raw sewage was omnipresent as he entered the house under the cover of darkness. Although that smell was ever present in his home and everyone else's, it still seemed to overwhelm him this time. It was a smell so noxious and typical in his life that he was ordinarily oblivious to it. However, after listening to Addison's lecture, the stench was almost more than Nigel could stand. He fell asleep with the window wide open despite the damp chill, as it at least tempered the smell enough for him to fall asleep.
So, Nigel Crumbly's conversation with the professor and then his parents didn't go well. But then he spent some time listening to a lecture by Addison Way. His eyes begin to open. He's beginning to realize this is not about water. This is about large new knowledge coming into the world and how that knowledge is met by the authorities, the people in charge. Not well. History has shown that. Meanwhile, that wraps up Chapter 14 of The Village Idiot. Next episode is on to Chapter 15 of The Village Idiot. We'll see you then. In the meantime, until we meet again, goodbye, good luck, and stay dry. Good night.